Imogen Lamport from 16 Style Types. Welcome. Today we are talking all things INTJ, the independent stylist, the style scientist, and their approach to style. So I'm just waiting for Jill Chivers to join me, which she'll be here very soon, I'm sure. And this one is close to my heart as I have INTJ preferences. And it's one of those things I learned about myself at university. So when I was at university, we did the MBTI or the Myers-Briggs test, as it's often known. Saying Jill's watching. It's not letting me allow her to join. Hold on. Yes, I can see you, Jill, there. But for some reason or other, allow your guest. Here we are. Add. Just adding Jill. There we go. All working now. I learnt back in my early 20s, or probably even 19, when I discovered my INTJ-ness. And it was interesting. Hey, Jill.
Hi.
Because, I think I'd always felt like I was a bit different from other people, and it explained a little bit about I just happened to think a little bit differently from a lot of the population. So here we are, back together again. Please feel free to ask any INTJ questions you may have that, we would love to answer. And I've got a couple that have been asked already that we will be answering a bit later on as well. But feel free to type a comment in here and let us know if you have any specific INTJ questions.
Did you want to do an overview of INTJ, particularly as you have insider knowledge about INTJ, and then I'll add in a few things from my experience?
What's interesting is sometimes when you're very close to the subject, is it just me or am I INTJ? Is it my INTJ? Because of course we're not just our type. We also have cultural backgrounds and families and all those sorts of things. But I think one of the things that would be common with INTJs is we have an independent streak. Really don't like being in and told by people. And this relates back to style as well. We tend to be quite private. Often people will think I share a lot, but I actually spend a lot of time thinking about what I'm going to share. I don't just share willy-nilly. There's a lot of thought and decision-making that's gone on to the sharing. We're quite future-focused. I think that's very typical of the intuitive types, tend to be thinking more into the future. And so don't hold on to the past quite as much, but I know there's things I've bought over time that remind me of things. So it's not like I let go of everything as well. But often I like to think into the future. Quite driven. I've always been told I'm very driven as a person. And also intense. And that's something I didn't realize. I never thought I was intense. I always thought I was really laid back and flexible. I've been pointed out many times by other people of just how intense I am. And it's one of those things I think that often you just don't see in yourself. Can be kind of reserved as well, and also can be quite direct. Though I have learnt, I think actually in many ways, that you can be direct, but also kind of very diplomatic. I've also been told in my life that I'm really quite diplomatic by many people. And it's because I think there's always an awareness, when you are aware, or when you are aware that there might be a situation you're going into that you go, well, I don't necessarily want to hurt other people or have those things. So maybe direct, but also can be diplomatic as well. Not necessarily always just two boots in without thinking. So our INTJ is our style scientist, and we named her this because, and this is the thing I've noticed in my own life, I have had a quest for the why. I always want to know why. Like when I was at school, when I was doing maths at school, anything, if you couldn't tell me why I needed to do this, why, where's the reason, why, what's the purpose of this, learning this equation, I couldn't learn it. Just
Yeah.
can't learn stuff if I don't understand why it has some value. What is the purpose? What is the reason? And that comes down to dressing as well. So I think you'll tend to find that when you understand your whys, things become much easier for you. Um, so very much a how and why sort of person, and then there's the how kind of comes out of the why as well. So for me, it was, when I was a teenager, and I always remember going into a store with a friend, like a major department store, and we both tried on the same dress, and she looked amazing in it, and I looked terrible. And the thing was, is it was exactly the same size, and it wasn't that one of us was busting out of it and the other one wasn't. We both got it on and it fit. It's just that made me go, well, why does she look great and I look terrible? And that was that first, why for me as far as clothes went. To know, well, there must be something different about my body from her body, and that's why some shapes suit her and other shapes suit me. And in fact, at the time, I was also sewing a lot of my own clothes. And so for me, then, you spend hours and hours making something, and then to discover it looks terrible on you, it's not for your body shape. That also was another thing. I was like, well, why does this shape work and that shape doesn't? And that for me was that kind of quest for knowledge. And that quest for knowledge is quite well known within the INTJ population.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, NTs are, if we just look at function pairs, the two middle letters of all of the 16 types, NTs are especially well known for a drive for knowledge and a push for competency. That applies to all four of the NT types. The INTJ is particularly interesting. Together with INFJ, they are often considered the most talkative of the introverted types, which is really interesting because they both share introverted intuition. And what's important for us to learn, those of us who are extroverted, is anyone who's introverted, their most important function, their most well-developed function is an internal one, is an introverted one. And this has been a really important learning for me in all the introverts that I deal with, but particularly INTJs and INFJs. To be aware of that, because they're often very verbally skilled, they're interested in communication and words and language, and they often are very articulate and erudite, and we can get confused. If we only ever look at behaviour, we can think we're looking at someone who's extroverted. And of course they are engaging in behaviour that we assign to extroversion, talking, but without recognising the importance of what's going on beneath the surface. We often miss how important that sense of inner vision is, that sense of just knowing. I think this is one of the hallmarks of INTJs that I have learned, this sense that they just know things. And it can be disarming for those of us who don't operate that way, particularly those of us who are S, where we rely on data, it's practical, or our five senses, or memory, or how we've done things before. It can be kind of unsettling that someone not only knows, but they're really confident in that knowing. And this is another hallmark, I think, of INTJs, and that strong individualistic streak, that strong independence streak, and need to understand things. A lot of times in descriptions of the 16 types, they will talk about jobs that people should have. And I find myself resisting that information because I find it can be misleading. So one of the things that's said about INTJs is that they don't particularly have an interest in style. I have found that to be totally and utterly untrue in so many circumstances. What I think is true is that when INTJs turn their attention to something, they turn it in a particular way. There is a pattern to how they engage with something that really captures their attention. And I mean, Imogen is Australia's #1 style blogger, and she is an expert. She is stylish herself, and she's taught countless thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of women things about style they didn't know. And yet, if you look at so many of the sort of careers sections on INTJs, it never mentions it. So I think that the specific area that people can be interested in is less relevant than the way in which they approach it, should it capture their attention.
Yes. So, and I think that's the thing, is it's like, I mean, we're all supposed to be scientists and, engineers, I think. That's what we're told when we're
Architects,
INTJ.
that's another one. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yes,
So,
solitary, analytical, big picture kind of jobs.
yes. And so I think what's really fascinating actually about style and INTJ-ness is we definitely are mood people. And I think, and
Yeah.
we've talked about this before, we've got a blog post about how intuitives tend to be mood dressers. So, and I think what's interesting about is an NJ as well is that the J that tends to make you go, I need to be appropriate. So, so that's one of those things that INTJs are always aware of appropriateness, of wanting to make sure they're seen as credible. That, I mean, we like to think we're smart. We like other people to think we're smart too. So not just
Mm.
thinking we're smart ourselves.
Yeah.
And so the last thing I want to do is reduce my credibility. And I think this
Mm.
is where, when you're aware that your image is speaking without you opening your mouth, that most INTJs are aware of that. And so they want to be seen as credible and intelligent and intellectual and all those sorts of things. So
Mm.
they'll want to dress in a way that is always appropriate. So always being aware of what is the dress code. Unlike some N types who may not, it might be more about individuality, and being unique. And I want to be me, which is more the
Mm.
NP. The NJs have more of a understanding of that, what is appropriate. And so tempering that individuality, because there is a creative and independent streak with what is appropriate. And I think that's something that other types could learn, particularly types who don't think about appropriateness at all and actually are doing themselves a disservice. Because that's one of the things I'll notice. Sometimes with some types, it's like, well, nobody can tell me what to wear, or I should just wear what I like, and they can just learn that I've got a big brain. But in fact, they're making it harder for themselves. And I think that's something that the INTJ does well, is knows what is appropriate and takes that into consideration, understands that they are putting messages out with their appearance. You got
Yeah.
anything else to say
And
about that?
yeah, no, the first step of that is awareness. And I would agree that INTJs seem to have a heightened awareness about that as opposed to a couple of the other NT types whose awareness of that, well, it's not there because their awareness is somewhere else. And so that is really important about INTJness is they're often on board with the idea that the way they're presenting themselves makes a big difference. Why that's important is because they don't have to expend any energy convincing themselves of the value of the enterprise. They can then move into, well, how do I do it? And how do I do it in a way that's, and then of course you're in a whole other landscape there. How do I do it in a way that's authentic for me? I think sometimes the approach can be, I'll just follow somebody else's formula. I would caution INTJs against that. It might work in the short term, say if you're moving, from education into the workforce or major transitions, that's a shortcut that you can certainly take. In the long term, I don't think that's sustainable for INTJs because they need to find out for themselves. They need to chart their own course, and they are the chart the course interaction style. And so that's really important.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very important. I know for myself, when I've gone to workplaces, I would observe what is other people wearing, what's appropriate, and then I will make my own version of that. What we really dislike is turning up somewhere and somebody else wearing the same thing.
Right.
That's, you know, that's quite crucifying. Even if we are appropriate, it's like, but I'm an individual, and I don't ever want to be wearing the same outfit as somebody else.
Yeah,
So one of
right.
the things that INTJs may do is if you ask them where they bought something, they might lead you astray. They might tell you somewhere that they didn't get it,
Yeah.
because they don't want you looking exactly the same as them.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Because
might
their
even learn to
ideas are not the same. Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
I think ideas are different.
Mm.
But I think there's that individuality and there's a creative element. And I think that's something that is a wonderful thing to be harnessed by an INTJ. When you allow that introverted intuition to kind of have a play, and
Mm.
use that as using your style as a creative expression. I think when I look back when I was younger, and I probably dressed more to a formula and the same sort of thing. And I was dressing in the old days, when workplaces were much more formal and there was much more of a kind of everybody wore the same thing.
Right.
First, like, but now it's like going, I really have so much more fun going, well, what can I put together? And I challenge myself. So one of the
Yeah.
things I do is I challenge myself to put together outfits from my existing wardrobe that I've never put together before. I do this
Right.
quite frequently rather than relying on the same thing with the same thing with the same thing. I'll go, can I put it together in a different way? Like, this is a little intellectual challenge that and I think
Yeah.
that challenge is something that we love as an INTJ. We enjoy a
Oh, yeah.
challenge. Uh, sometimes I might rail against it, but I do enjoy it. So, like, can you create your own challenges in your wardrobe so that you stay fresh? And I think that's one of those things is challenging yourself gives you a freshness rather than when you keep doing the same thing over and over, it can get a little bit dull and boring, and you can start to bore yourself.
Yeah.
So that's something I think that's a bit of fun. And
Mm.
being a mood dresser, so as much as I love the idea of, picking out an outfit for the week or the month or, like whatever, I'll often wake up the next day and go, no, I don't feel like that anymore.
Mm.
It doesn't feel
Which
right
every
today.
time I hear that, and I've heard that a lot, it never ceases to amaze me. So I love that. Yeah, absolutely. That is the other point that you made that I think is really. Oh, sorry, you wanted to say something else?
I was just going, Gemma's just commented about she hates wearing uniforms. And I can say, I have worked places where they've said, I'm going to bring in a uniform. And I said, I'm quitting then. Like, that is how strongly I feel
Yeah.
about wearing uniforms. And I think it's probably pretty common amongst INTJs that
Mm-hmm.
you just don't put us in uniforms. We can't, uniforms are like a straight jacket
Right.
inside a box where the lid's
Right.
been nailed shut.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's actually, it actually feels like my entire, and I don't know, there's a freedom thing that I have. It's always like this, and I think this is probably to do with this intuition and this future focus that just feels like I am being so closed down as a person that I can't even
Mm.
think.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. That's very powerful, isn't it?
yeah, is
Yeah.
that for you, Gemma? Does that
Mm.
ring true?
The point I wanted to make while we wait for Gemma to respond is the combining of the analytical approach, which is very characteristic of INTJs. They are considered an analytical, strategically analytical approach with creativity. And I think sometimes those two things are seen as going in opposite directions or in opposition to one another. And what I love about what we do here at 16 Style Types and what you have done with your dressing styles is that we can combine the way that we choose to dress in any way that really suits us and our authentic style pathway, being true to ourselves, is about combining the elements that make up who we are. And INTJs are capable of enormous, all of the types are capable of creativity. They just do it in different ways. There is original creativity that comes through with INTJs. And it happens in a particular way, but there is definitely a combining of the strategic analytical with the creative. I think the thing that I notice with INTJs is the creativeness always is in service to some kind of functionality. It isn't just creating into the void, if you like. There is always a functional component that's visible from where the creativity is happening.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And what's really interesting is I grew up in much because I couldn't, oops, still just dropped out. We'll pop it back in a second. So one of the things I found is growing up, I thought I'm not creative because I'm not great at, my dancing, like I have difficulty memorizing choreography in the way that my daughter just picks it up like that because she's an SP. They have a physical ability that I just don't have. And I, played the violin and viola, but I was never brilliant at it. I, do craft hobbies and all that sort of stuff, and I could do them, but I was never that kind of, that really good. So I just felt I wasn't creative. And one of the things I've learnt as life has gone on is that creativity isn't just about the arts. It's about ideas. And what I've discovered is I have a lot of ideas, and ideas are a form of creativity. There's a lot of people who don't have that sort of ability to think up many different ideas and see different perspectives. And I think that's one of the joys of INTJs is we have this ability to see multiple perspectives on something, and to we can change our mind. We might have thought about something, we might have come up with an idea, but we can change our mind. We can see if there's a better way. We can see a different way. What's really interesting, Gemma, you've mentioned you've learned sewing and knitting. Very often in midlife and a bit older, particularly with INTJs, we use our extroverted sensing, which is our least developed function in the kind of the major 4-hour sensing function. We use them as relaxation. So for me, sewing and knitting and stuff is brilliant form of relaxation because it takes me outside of my head. I think an INTJ can spend an awful lot of time up here and in the ideas land, and I enjoy spending my ideas, but it's not relaxing in the way that sometimes doing something physical takes me out of my head and into that kind of the physical. So it's really quite fascinating that that we can do that. So often you'll really notice that, particularly as you get older, that that's a form of relaxation. So hopefully Jill will come back in a second. So we're good at big picture. We see the big picture and we're problem solvers in that way. Now, one of the things I think that also others could learn from INTJs is we don't have to fill a wardrobe gap with the first thing we see. We're looking for the right thing, the thing that's going to work. I think we're eminently very practical. And so therefore, that we're going to wait until we see the thing that is the right thing, rather than just going, oh, my black pants have fallen to pieces, I need to buy new black pants. And so just go and buy the first pair I see, versus I will wait until I see the pair that's the right fabric and the right style and and it's got some interesting detail and it's got all those things, rather than just settling. And I think that's something that other types could probably find useful to think about, is that sometimes it's that I have that ability to step back. I don't have to rush in and buy the first thing I see. And I've had things on my list that sometimes have been there for years, but I'd rather wait and find a really great one than just get something to fill that gap. And I think that's something also that's a useful little thing for other types who might sometimes, not do that so much. And another thing too that we'll often do is that that if we've got an idea about something, it's often it's about the vision in the head. We've got the big vision in the head. But when we're out looking, so I might think, I really want a blue cardigan. Now, I'll be going out and I'll be looking and I might think I want it to look a certain thing, but I might find a teal cardigan that actually will work for all the things that I wanted the blue cardigan to work for. And that's okay. I don't need to have the specific one with the specific, details as well. So we can see that something else could be put in its place that we hadn't actually thought about, but it will fulfill the same criteria. So I think that's another thing that INTJs do well.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Obviously having a few technology issues, which let's not even talk about that.
No. Anything else that you think the INTJ does particularly well, Jill?
Well, I'm not sure how much of that creativity and analytical stuff, whether you got all of that or whether it dropped out, because I was, so engrossed in what I was saying, I wasn't watching what was happening with my internet. But the final point I was making there was about how my experience of INTJs is their original creativity is always in service to something that's functional. And I think that's one of the things that differentiates it from other forms of creativity.
Yes. So we've had a couple of questions as well. Is there anything else, before we go into those questions, is there anything else you wanted to say about INTJs as a whole?
No, I think we've covered the main points. The strong takeaway message, I would say, is that INTJs need to chart their own style course. That is essential for it to feel like them, for them to be true to themselves, and for it to be sustainable. It's going to take more time, but it's going to feel more like them. They're going to feel less like an imposter or wearing a costume, and more so than many other style types that applies to INTJs.
Yes. So Katie's asked, all my questions seem strange. uh, Nothing short of fabulous is acceptable to me. How do I temper that with reality? Workplace complex, the urge to vaguely fit in while not being the same as everyone else. And I think we've talked a little bit about this, appropriate, but still being independent and an individual. I feel like this is not a normal question. I see it as very normal as far as
Me
an
too.
INTJ goes. How does one find individuality amidst a fast fashion, the rise of the chain store, or within a budget? When going to the boutique or individual shop is not an option. I would say, I think too, not all boutiques have to be massively expensive, and there are things called sales where you get things cheaper. They're things I look out for, where I go, maybe it'll not be in my budget right now, but maybe down the track it will be. There's also, I think, it's that yeah, the fast fashion and the chain store in the mall is not really the INTJ's preferred place to shop on the whole, because it's too much like everybody else. So sometimes it's looking for the more unique piece in that landscape, which you'll find. But then there is things like, the thrift store can be a great place. Learning to sew. Now, we may not be the best sewers in the world. Sometimes, I'm okay, but sometimes I can just get a little bit haphazard, a little bit slapdash. My little attention to detail sometimes to some of those things isn't as perfect as somebody else's might be. But often I can do a good enough job, and knowing my limitations. So one of the things I've done, say I wanted skirts last year. I couldn't find a straight skirt that wasn't a mini skirt, that wasn't in a grey, work fabric sort of thing. And so I ended up going and buying a whole lot of fabrics. And I know I can do a stretch knit, and I don't need to put a zip in. And so I work within my limitations to get me some pieces that are unique and different that I couldn't find in stores.
Mm. And that's
So,
also something you could have a seamstress make for you at very little cost also.
yeah,
It's not an elaborate piece of clothing that would cost a fortune. If you didn't sew or didn't want to, you couldn't have someone make for you.
yes. So I think there's that. And then sometimes it's about, well, can I tweak it with accessories? Can I take this basic piece, this basic outfit that's appropriate, and tweak it with an accessory or something that makes it more unique and different? And I think too, when you have got a limited budget, I'd rather have less pieces that are just better, more unique, more me, rather than lots of pieces that just don't float my boat.
Yeah.
So it could be I'll save up longer and have fewer pieces so I can find those more unique and interesting pieces. And I think particularly when you do see those amazing, unique and interesting pieces, if they really call to you, buy them. Because often they're the ones that you regret later, when you then can't find anything that you really like. And then you're spending money on stuff that feels like settling. And I think that's really uncomfortable, an uncomfortable feeling.
The other thing I've noticed as to that question of matching reality up with visions in your head for INTJs is how you combine things. That you can buy things that are from the mall or the high street, things that might even have elements of fast to them. But you don't have to wear them in the way that they appear in store or in the window. And sometimes just one or two of those kinds of pieces combined, like the accessories idea, but also the entire ensemble, how you put the entire thing together, and doing that in a way that nobody else can copy. So even if you're wearing a piece that somebody else might be wearing that same piece, it's almost unrecognizable as being the same because you've put it together in a different way.
Yes. Another question from Katie. I'm largely disinterested in fashion. How do I incorporate being current into style without feeling like a fashion victim or the extreme realizing that you're wearing something from 10 years ago? I actually think what's interesting about INTJ is because we just absorb by osmosis stuff. So we use our sensing, we're absorbing all the information. This is how we know stuff. We're not just making it up. We are actually, things are coming in, things are bypassing, like coming by, and we're picking things up. So you're out there in the street, you're seeing what other people are wearing. You may not consciously be thinking about it, but I do actually think you have a natural awareness of what's going to be in fashion and in style. So you're less likely to get stuck in a time warp because A, you do have the natural future focus, and B, that you are always observing by osmosis what's going on around you. And so as much as you're not thinking about it directly often, it's already coming by. And so you might just stop wearing something that's, 10 years old. Or if you are wearing something 10 years old, it's because it still works. It's because it still has enough of whatever is the current fashion that you absolutely can still wear it. It's enough of a classic piece. So I think I wouldn't worry too much about that as an INTJ. Have your thoughts on that, Jill?
Yeah, I agree. And but personally, universally, I'm not a huge fan of fashion, as I have publicly stated many, many times. To me, the game is style, and style is always an individual, personal pursuit. So that's just a general comment that I think applies to all 16 style types. That future focus being so strong and that inner vision, combining those two things together, I think is where you will be able to sort the wheat from the chaff, fashion versus style wise, actually an awful lot easier than what you might imagine. And so I agree. It isn't something that if I was working with an INTJ, I would say is something to be particularly aware of. There are other style types I might say this is something we want to, bring up on the priority chain. But I agree, this sense of just knowing things. I would also add, if style hasn't been something that you have chosen to focus some education on, do a little bit of that. That will also feed into your need for why, give you that sense of structure, give you some of the science behind it. That's going to help feed into both that vision that you have and that future focus.
Yeah. So I think, knowing some stuff, but just being aware that you are more aware than you think you are. You may not be able to pin down, like if somebody said, what's
Yeah,
the latest fashion trends? You might not be able to pin that down.
correct.
Way that some types would be able to. But it's unlikely you'll be looking really dated in the way that some other types will be, because you have this awareness of what's going on in the world, and you have a future, that natural future focus. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Are there
The
any?
trap you may, oh, sorry.
I was just
The
going to say,
trap that, oh, we ran out of time. Sorry.
no, you go.
Oh, I was going to say the trap that some INTJs can fall into is not that they're looking out of date, but that their look is no longer working for them, that something has moved on and they've been paying attention to that other thing. And so when they bring their attention back to style, that's when they can find that the updating is happening because of some change in their life, a change in location or geography or home situation or whatever it is.
And look, I think too that if you are paying any attention to style and fashion, um, that it's a pretty easy, if you want to go, am I still in style? It's pretty easy just to go into a store and go, could I buy something like what I'm wearing today? And if there's nothing there like it, maybe then there's an assessment that needs to be done, about whether you are looking dated or not. But yeah, and it's that much less inclined to go for the fast fashion anyway. There's less of that, I need to have part of that trend. Though sometimes because of that future focus, there's an enjoyment. And I think a lot of INTJs are more likely to buy the cheap end of a trend. Like if there's a real kind of fashion trend that's going on, might go, okay, well, I'll get it, but I'm not spending a lot of money on it because I know it's not going to be a long-term piece in my wardrobe, versus I'll spend more money on the things that are going to be around for a long time. So,
Yeah.
So is there anything else you want to talk about with INTJs, or are there any other questions? Lynn, I know you're an INTJ. You got any questions about style and INTJ-ness? Or Gemma, got anything else? Any other INTJs who would like to ask any questions?
While we wait for that, another observation I've made when I've been at type conferences and seeing INTJs en masse, such as they are a very rare type, and at type conferences doesn't tend to be dozens and dozens of them. If we had to look at a scale that we just subjectively put interesting at one end and approachable at the other, just randomly picking those two things, they're always at the interesting scale. Whether or not they're approachable or not is not really comes into the picture, but they're almost always interesting. And to me, I think that is right for INTJs. For some other style types, being approachable would be incredibly important, and to think that they might not especially be projecting that would be something they would want to fix. I don't feel that's true for INTJs, that they enjoy being interesting, and whether or not that makes them approachable or not is either not a part of the equation, further down on the priority list of things they want their style to do for them.
Yes. And I think that's that individuality streak, that I'd rather be an individual than look like everybody else. And if looking like everybody else means, or it means I'm going to look less approachable, I'm okay with that. And I think INTJs probably always feel a bit different because we're not common in the population as a whole. Apart from at type conferences, the rest of the population, you really don't meet too many of us. And so we often can feel a bit like we're aliens. I mean, I think I've always felt unlike everybody else I know
Right.
in my lifetime. And it's because there's very few of me around. Now, I've met a few in recent years, but up until that point, is that I just know I don't think the same way everybody else does. So I've never felt like I fit in the way that some types fit in really easily. I've always felt like I was out on a limb anyway. So therefore, maybe that's also partly why, well, I don't want to be the same as everybody else.
Yeah. And this is the gift of type, I think, to make us feel that we are not alone, we are not aliens, and that there are other people who share those same preferences as we do, and it's not strange. In fact, it's very legitimate. And then your type journey continues on from that point.
Yes. So there's no other questions about being INTJ and an approach to style. We will probably leave it there for today, and we'll be back next month talking about another style type.